told Tad many a times that his podcast, episode number 35, is really the reason that made me dive deep into living soil. Yet again, it was also hundreds of customers on the phone telling me that living soil is the way and I got to stop using bottles. And, you know, it was at that point of listening to his podcast that I kind of really just, you know, dove down that first rabbit hole. But I'm very happy with what I do, what I produce, and I feel wealthy as far as that goes. I'm not wealthy or a rich man, but I'm wealthy in other ways. And growing cannabis definitely helps me feel that way and get there in my life. So a little bit of what you guys could expect today. We have multiple speakers. We do have workshops going on at the same time as the speakers. But we've hired some amazing people to capture this event in all different areas. So the speaking hall, everything is going to be recorded here. We have our workshops. The main starting area for the workshop is going to be over in the main hall, the far end of the building. That's where Steve and all of our stuff is going to be for the starting point for the workshop. Obviously, Catalyst Bioamendments is going to be doing their class over here. So we're going to have that starting point. So if you want to be involved in the workshop, or any of the workshops, the starting point's going to be over there in the building, and then we can distribute ourselves out to where we want to get physical with our hands and get dirty. We've got Leighton Morrison here a little bit later on today is going to be doing a soil layering class. So that is impactful stuff everybody wants to see. So don't feel like you're going to miss anything, guys, because we're doing a really good job recording everything. We're going to get it edited as soon as possible and get it into your email inboxes. You all have probably created a login to the Grassroots website, and that's where we're going to go back to find all of this stuff. So if you guys need help with that at any point and getting access to any of this information, let me know. Steve's here. You can say a few words, my man.
Welcome to the farm, everybody. Appreciate you guys all coming out. Yeah, just a couple of house rules, guys. Just try not to walk on the soil. No smoking cannabis, trying to keep a cannabis-free environment. But yeah, just enjoy, guys. If you guys need anything, feel free to grab me or any of my team, any of the Grassroots team. You know, we're here to facilitate you guys' time. So again, just thanks for coming out, guys. Yeah, enjoy it.
Thank you. So we've got a few moments here. I just want to thank our sponsors. Fos Lighting has done an amazing job. They're the reason we can have this big, beautiful tent, this amazing stage. So please, if you guys get a chance, go over and thank them. Obviously, our other sponsors, Organics Alive, Vital Garden Supply, New Age Laboratories. We've got Skunk Magazine and GLP Farm for letting us come out and hang out here. So thankful for all those sponsors around us. Thank you guys. If you need anything at all, find us in a few moments here. We're going to start out with the KIS Organics crew. We've got a 3-part setup here, and you guys are going to go through some very faceted stuff. You're going to get to do some plant trivia, I think. So come on up here, guys. We're ready to get going.
All right, let's get started. Well, first off, I just want to say thank you to Grassroots for hosting this amazing event, and thank you to Steve and GLP for making this location available to us. It's really awesome to get everyone together, see faces face to face, rather than just over social media. So for our talk, what we're going to do today is try and get across a whole bunch of information in a really short amount of time. We want to break it up between the three of us, Brandon Hudson and Ben Higgins, are also with KIS Organics. We just thought that would make it more interesting. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the best things I've learned from 6 years of podcasting and interviews. I'm going to try and fit that into 15, 20 minutes. And then after that, Brandon's going to come on and talk about a dichotomous key. And then Ben's going to discuss the metrics to measure in your grow room and how to interpret that data. And then we'll take a quick 5-minute break. I'm going to come back and talk about critical thinking regarding the inputs you use in your garden, like what's safe and what's not safe to use. And then Ben's going to cover what we think all growers might want to have in their pantry, just on hand for growing high-quality cannabis. And then ending if we have time with some plant trivia as a way of talking about different horticultural concepts that we think are interesting. So I started the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast over 6 years ago. It was a way to bridge the gap between academic research and actual growers in the field. And originally I wanted to write a book, but then I realized that not many folks are reading books these days, and frankly, a lot of folks are much smarter than me and specialized in different aspects of cultivation, like entomology or HVAC or all of these different things. So it was really an opportunity to hear from them rather than me trying to repeat what they were saying in a written form. So I want to start off by paying a little bit of tribute to Clackamas Coop. He was one of my very first interviews, and I've had hundreds of hours on the phone with him. I've had dinners with him. The guy really is a coot. He's a lot of fun, and he said a few things that really stuck with me over the years. So when I first started formulating soils, one of the things that he talked about with me was a quarter cup to a cup per cubic foot is just a good range for most organic inputs based on the NPK. So if it's a really high NPK product, use it at a lower rate. If it's something a little like a calcium product, things like that, you might really go a little higher. But if you're just going to mix your own soils, you're not going to test, you're just going to throw the kitchen sink at it, that's a good range to start with. And he really popularized the Cornell method, this idea of a third compost, a third peat, and a third aeration. That's a great starting point for most mixes. I personally use a little bit different formulation with our soil. We use a little less compost and a few other things, but I'm happy to talk about that, and then if anyone wants to grab me or ask questions about it. But a third works really well. And then the last thing is, Koo would always say, you're not growing in Koo sticks because you don't have my worm castings. And the way I always interpreted that is, it's really important to formulate around your compost. Everyone's compost source is going to be different. It's going to have different biology, it's going to have different nutrient levels, and so ideally, if we were formulating the soil, we would calculate it based off of what that compost is bringing to the table. And then moving on to Steve Solomon. Steve wrote Gardening to the West of the Cascades. He founded Territorial Seeds, so I already knew who he was from coming from the nursery industry. And he really introduced me to soil balancing, this idea that minerals should be there's optimal ranges and optimal levels for all these things. And the only way to really know that is through soil testing. Soil testing is the best tool we have for managing the fertility of our soil. And then the soil targets, this is something Bryant and I have talked about in a lot of our podcasts together, is that the metrics and targets for what we call living soil, which is actually soilless media or potting soil, is very different than actual soil, actual sand, silt, and clay. So it's important to adjust that accordingly and understand what you're looking at. Logan Labs has a table right next to ours, so you can go talk to them, or you could look at a lab test before we're over there too and kind of show you some of the metrics that don't really make sense when we're evaluating a soil test from them on what we call living soils. And then the targets for cannabis are very different. So when Steve wrote this book, his entire focus around mineralization was to create nutrient-dense vegetables, healthy, nutritious vegetables. It wasn't to maximize crop yields. It wasn't to target a plant like cannabis. He was really looking at everything from lettuce to tomatoes and trying to do a broad brush of just over-mineralization, so there were luxury levels of these minerals. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're reading his book or listening to him, that was really his focus, and it wasn't on commercial cannabis cultivation. And he talks about this too. And I couldn't give a talk without paying some tribute to my good friend Jaya. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. He dealt with a lot of just demons in his life and struggled with addiction. And he really was a genius. He was one of my best friends. And he really created a lot of what KIS Organics is today. I met him when I was literally in my parents' driveway mixing compost, mixing some of my first cannabis soils for my own grow. He showed up to get some compost tea supplies. We started chatting. I sent him home with some soil. He came back a few months later and wanted to talk about it because he wanted to switch over from this organic bottled nutrient program he was running. And we became friends, and he was always at the cutting edge of things. If you go back and listen to one of his podcasts, it was one of my first interviews. He was talking about VPD and beneficial insects and PAR levels 10, 15 years ago, when these were concepts that really were not as popular as they are now today. And one of the things that the Jaya really drilled in my head is that canopy determines yield, not plant count, not veg times. Whatever we can do to create a canopy as fast as possible is going to give us our optimal yield times and as quickly as we can. The other thing that Jaya established was, many of you that use blue mats are familiar with 100 MBAR as sort of being the range that they started recommending. That was done in KIS soil by Jaya. He was the one that started using them originally within our group of friends and really popularized them for us. And so you'll want to adjust that based off of the media that you're using, the physical properties of the soil, the water retention properties of that soil. But if you just need a starting point, 100 MBAR is a great place to start. And then also communal planting has increased yield benefits. So originally Jaya was in a bunch of 7-gallon pots on a giant flex tray, and he's cramming these pots together, and the roots started growing in between and touching each other, and he started getting better results. And he's like, well, shit, why am I dealing with all these containers? Why don't I just throw in a bed? And then we started looking at how do we re-amend that soil so we don't have to move soil in and out of the house at 3 o'clock in the morning because it's super sketchy. And so that's where, for our group, I'm not saying he invented this. You know, I know a lot of people were concurrently doing these things around that time. But for our group, that was where this whole thing started. Moving on to Suzanne Wainwright Evans. She is the best entomologist, in my opinion, in the horticulture industry, the ornamentals industry, and the cannabis industry. She's a wealth of information, and I just wanted to distill my hours and hours of podcasts with her down to like 5 things that I got approval to say from her, because she's a stickler. And the first one is it all starts with a positive ID. I can't tell you how many times I've had people reach out to me like, oh my gosh, I need to spray. And really what they were looking at was like an orchid mite that was harmless, or they had springtails or things like that, or maybe they had too many isopods or roly-polies. But whatever that is, you have to get a positive ID so you know what your plan of attack is, or if it's even something that requires an application based on the economic importance of that pest or insect that you're seeing. It might be beneficial for us with living soils. And then next, pests cannot develop a resistance to being eaten. This is huge. It's the one thing that we can apply that's safe, that is consistent, that's going to work while we're not there in the facility ourselves or in our grow space. And we don't have to worry about pests building up resistance to a pesticide. And then this is just something I'm sure you guys all know, but I bring it up because there was a time in my life where I would have thought I was being more eco-friendly by applying a pesticide at a lower rate. I'm like, oh, I'll just use a little less, it'll be better. And the reason that's a bad idea is because what I mentioned before with resistance. If pests get sprayed and they don't die, they're more likely to develop a resistance to that pesticide or that chemistry, and you're going to have more issues down the road. And now we're developing pest-resistant insects, spray-resistant insects. So, always important to spray at the label rate. That label rate is designed to reduce phytotoxicity and give you your optimal kill ratio. So, if you have to spray something that is a chemistry, is a pesticide, make sure to follow the label rate and always wear the proper PPE. And then the other thing was always to apply beneficials early when the plant and canopy is smaller. It's way more affordable, it's going to be more effective, and you're not trying to deal with something late in flower that may have grown into a bigger problem. So that's why scouting and application early is always best. Like I always want to bring in, at the very least, SF nematodes. And then I will want to bring in one form of beneficial mite depending on what pest pressures I have in my area. And then when you go online, try not to use Instagram for getting your pests identified, or Facebook. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I can't say that enough. I've seen misinformation, and I know enough to know that I shouldn't be out there giving IPM advice or identifying pests. I always have a Suzanne in my back pocket, or other entomologists like Kelly Vance is another person I turn to make sure that I know what I'm actually dealing with, and then I have the best practice to move forward with it. So just be careful where you get your information on pests. And then lastly, this was something I didn't know. I always thought ladybugs were like the coolest thing, and you'd see them in the stores. Please don't buy ladybugs. I did a whole podcast on this. You can literally Google "don't buy ladybugs," but they're wild harvested. They damage local ecology. They spread disease. They're sort of the dark side of the beneficials industry, and it's something that we're always trying to get the information out. So if one person hadn't heard that, then I'll call that a win today. So moving on, Ben Hartman. Ben changed the way that I looked at farming and looked at cultivation. Having run a 7-acre farm, I was constantly walking around the property trying to find tools and trying to get everything together so I could do a project, and it was a lot of waste. And so he took this idea of lean manufacturing, something that Toyota really established, I think in the 80s or 90s, and made it understandable for those of us that are growing plants. And the biggest thing he talks about is reducing muda, which is waste. And waste can be in the form of your time, it can be in the form of products that you're buying, it can be in the form of your emotional energy thinking about a project. So how do we reduce those things is really the key to all of that. And that really involves around getting the right tools in the right location to save time and money. And it's funny because Ben works over at Gold Leaf Gardens, and they have signs up that show pictures of what stations are supposed to look like, so the next person there knows exactly what they have to do. Everything gets put back exactly where it is, so no one's searching for things. But these guys would go, I'd go down there to visit them, and one of the guys came up to me and he's like, yo, I'm reducing muda in my house. I've been thinking a lot about this. I used to keep my toilet paper in the garage. Now I keep it under the bathroom sink. So I have 2 steps to get my toilet paper to replace that roll, Just always thinking about how do I make things more efficient, I think is a really useful tool. And if you haven't read this book, I think it's a great book to check out. This was one of the podcasts where I learned the most about mycorrhizal fungi. It's something that I've always been really fascinated with. It's a symbiotic fungus that forms a relationship with the roots of your plants. I've been on the fence on whether or not to add it to my grow or not because the information around it is really mixed. But Dr. Yorm Kapolnik, he's with the Volcani Institute. He is an expert on mycorrhizal fungi. He's out of Israel. And he covered a lot in the podcast I did with him. But some of the highlights for me were that with any microorganism product, there are different species with different tolerances to different abiotic conditions. So for example, mycorrhizal product A might be very drought tolerant. It can handle, it grew up in a desert condition, it can handle high stress from drought or things like that, or maybe high temperatures, whereas product B may have been sourced from another area, and that one might be better at cycling phosphorus or calcium, or have some other tolerance or ability. So, and this is true not just for mycorrhizal fungi, but for Bavaria, for any microbial product that you purchase. So if one doesn't work for you, don't assume that all will not work. You really have to try them out in your environment and see what results you get. Because I know in the Bavaria world, there's a lot of different products out there, so it's just good to know. And then the last one was that mycorrhizal fungi and trichoderma can be symbiotic. I've seen research to kind of go both ways on this topic, but from talking to him and a few other experts in the industry, it's actually something that can be used together. So we'll typically use a mycorrhizal product at the very beginning of the growth cycle when we're first planting right into the root zone, and then we might come back in with a trichodermic product a week or 2 later. The only time I would be careful with mycorrhizal fungi is if you are on very, very strict heavy metal requirements for your product in the legal market, because mycorrhizal fungi has been shown to help increase uptake of heavy metals. So it's just something you need to watch for. Don Marshall is a good friend of mine. He actually does not grow cannabis, but he started the horticulture program at Lake Washington College. He ran it there for 40 years. I went back to school just to take his botany class, so he was my botany professor. And he's just one of my favorite people in the world. And one of the things, I just went back and listened to his podcast and made a recent video on this. One of the things he talks about is that overwatering and underwatering have similar symptomatic displays, because they both cause root hair death. And root hairs, only 1 cell thick, they are where all the nutrient exchange happens, water uptake. So when they die, either from lack of water, so drought stress, the plant's no longer able to uptake water, we may see symptoms of yellowing or marginal leaf necrosis. Well, if we overwater, we're also killing root hairs, and we're getting drought stress from overwatering. And we can see the exact same above ground symptomatic effects. Same with salt stress. So watering can play a huge role. A lot of people automatically say, oh, this shows I need more nitrogen or more magnesium, whatever mineral, but a lot of times it's really just the availability of that nutrient based off of the way that we're watering in these soils. And the other thing Don really drove into my head is we have to be a detective when we walk into a grow. We should do this first thing in the morning, not at the end of the day when we're tired. But really look around and figure out what the limiting factor of growth is. Are these plants suffering because they're inside of the greenhouse that gets less airflow or more temperature, or maybe there's not enough light over here? But figuring out what it is that's going on to determine, is it a nutrient issue? Is it an uptake issue? Is it an environment issue? And always thinking about that. So even when things are perfect in my room, I'm thinking, okay, what's the next limiting factor of growth to push things even a little further? Now that everything's dialed, can I raise my PPFD up a little bit higher? Do I need to supplement a little bit more CO2? Just getting that all figured out, I think, is really important, and keeping that in mind. Another interview I did was Lee Brees. Lee is an independent crop consultant. He has a doctorate in plant health, and one of the things he points out is using soil testing as a tool to support what your physical senses are telling you. How the soil smells, how it feels. Those are all tools that you have all the time with you. You can measure moisture with your fingers. He wants to go in there and feel the soil and visually see it. So using these things to supplement the soil test and having the soil test reinforce what you're seeing in the field is really the best approach. You can smell actinobacteria, for example. They're going to give you that earthy smell. If that's not there, that probably tells you the soil is too compacted or waterlogged or has other issues. So it's always a good thing to think about. And then this was the biggest point I got from him that kind of really changed the way I think about cultivation. A lot of people talk about biomimicry, this idea that we want to mimic what nature is doing. And I was talking to him about that, and he's like, Tad, ag is not a natural system. You were purposely selecting for this one crop, and to the exclusion of almost all others. We may have a cover crop, we may have a companion crop, but at the end of the day, what we're really focused on is a single plant, and everything else is a weed. If these bugs are not helping us, they're a pest. That doesn't happen in nature. And when we move indoors to controlled environment agriculture, we have the ability to control all of these variables. Let's just make sure we're thinking in a way of what's really maximizing plant health and plant growth, rather than possibly what nature might do. Because nature creates flood events, nature creates all of these things that may not be optimal for what we're trying to do indoors with our crop. All right, I gotta speed this up. Nicole Gauthier, Kentucky professor and pathologist. A couple quick points from her are that most cannabis pathogens cannot be identified by visual symptoms. So you actually have to have a pathologist take a look. That there's 2 different species of PM that infect cannabis. I thought this was really interesting. One can survive at 40% humidity, which is crazy. So we have to know what we're dealing with and how we can combat it. And that there's a wide range of host plants for these 2 forms of powdery mildew. So if you have other plants in your grow or in your area, even though powdery mildew tends to be plant specific, with these species they can travel back and forth. So keep that in mind if you have plants that are susceptible to powdery mildew. I think of comfrey in my region is very susceptible to powdery mildew. I would want to be careful that the species infecting the comfrey every year, it's really inevitable where I live, it's not one that's going to create spores from my cannabis plants. And PM spores are very, very resilient. She talks a lot about this in the podcast. I found that really interesting and gives you some strategies for remediation. And then last point from her is always inspect the roots. I think people are afraid sometimes to knock a plant out of its pot and take a look at the roots, but that's one of the first things I want to do when I walk into a new facility and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So you should always take a look at your plant roots and know what they look like. And Pythium is one of the easiest things to identify that way.